Case 1. The classmates who wanted a horror story to become real. The case of Cassie Jo Stoddart begins with something painfully ordinary. A teenage girl was house-sitting for relatives in Pocatello, Idaho. Cassie was 16 years old. She was a high school student, a daughter, a friend, and someone trusted enough by her family to watch a home while relatives were away. Nothing about that evening should have placed her in danger. It should have been the kind of quiet night that passes without being remembered. But two boys from her school had been thinking about something dark. Their names were Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. They were also 16. They were classmates. To the outside world, they were teenagers who could still be redirected, still be corrected, still be saved from the worst parts of their own thoughts. But behind the normal image of school life, something disturbing had been building. Draper and Adamczyk had developed a violent fantasy. They were interested in horror movies, notoriety, and the idea of creating fear. This was not a sudden argument that turned deadly in a single emotional moment. The evidence later showed planning. It showed preparation. It showed two teenagers thinking about murder as if it were a project. That is what makes this case so unsettling. They did not only destroy Cassie's life. They also destroyed their own futures before they were old enough to fully understand what a future could be. On the night of September 22, 2006, Cassie was at the house she was watching. Draper and Adamczyk had been there earlier. The setting still looked normal enough from the outside. Teenagers visiting, friends spending time together, the kind of evening that did not immediately warn anyone of what was coming. But that image would not survive the investigation. After leaving, the boys returned. They cut power to the house in an attempt to frighten Cassie. They moved through the darkness with a plan that investigators would later uncover through evidence, statements, and recordings. What Cassie experienced that night was not a prank. It was not a game. It was a planned attack. Cassie was killed inside the home. Afterward, Draper and Adamczyk did what many young offenders mistakenly believe will save them. They tried to act normal. They attempted to distance themselves from the crime. They gave statements. They behaved as if the truth could be hidden if they kept repeating the right version of events. But detectives are trained to listen for what does not fit. They do not only hear the story being told. They compare it to time, movement, evidence, and behavior. And in this case, the boys had left behind more than they understood. The first cracks came through questioning and inconsistencies. Police looked at who had been around Cassie. They examined timelines. They pushed beyond the surface of teenage statements and began searching for proof. Then the investigation reached Black Rock Canyon. Brian Draper led investigators to evidence hidden there. That discovery became a major turning point. It showed that the boys had not simply been near the case. They had been connected to the crime in a way their earlier behavior could not explain away. But the most disturbing evidence was not only physical. It was recorded. Draper and Adamczyk had made videotapes connected to their planning and thoughts. Those recordings became one of the clearest windows into the mindset behind the crime. They showed a level of intention that made it impossible to treat the murder as a moment of confusion or panic. The recordings also exposed the arrogance of the plan. The boys seemed to imagine they were creating something frightening and unforgettable. They appeared to believe they could control the story, control the fear, control the aftermath, and still escape responsibility. But the very evidence that captured their fantasy helped convict them. In court, prosecutors did not have to rely only on speculation about motive. They could point to planning. They could point to the recordings. They could point to the evidence recovered during the investigation. They could show that the crime had been built before it happened. Draper and Adamczyk were both tried as adults. Both were convicted of first-degree murder. Both received life sentences. The legal outcome was severe because the crime was severe. Two teenagers who still had their own lives ahead of them had made a choice that ended Cassie's life and placed their own futures behind prison walls. That is the tragedy at the center of this case. Cassie Jo Stoddart was not a character in their fantasy. She was a real person. She had a family. She had friends. She had a life that should have continued far beyond one night in a house she was trusted to watch. And Draper and Adamczyk were not criminal masterminds. They were teenagers who believed the darkness in their imagination made them powerful. They thought the crime would make them known. They thought they could hide behind lies and secrecy. They thought they could make a horror story real and somehow remain outside the consequences. But detectives found the truth. The evidence spoke. The recordings revealed what they had planned. And the courtroom turned their fantasy into a permanent legal reality. This case disturbs people because it shows how dangerous teenage fantasy can become when it is fed by attention, secrecy, and the desire to feel important. It shows how quickly two lives with possible futures can collapse into one irreversible act. And it shows that a horrific choice does not become less real because the person making it is young. Cassie's life mattered before the crime. Her name should not be remembered only because of the boys who killed her. She was the victim of two classmates who mistook cruelty for power and attention for meaning. In the end, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk did not create the legend they imagined. They created grief. They created a courtroom record. They created life sentences. And they proved that one night, one plan, and one horrific choice can destroy every future it touches. Case 2. The best friends who made one lie last for months. Some crimes destroy the future because of anger. Others destroy it because of betrayal. But the case of Skylar Neese is disturbing for a different reason. It began inside a friendship. Not between strangers. Not between enemies who had spent years openly fighting. But between three teenage girls who once laughed together, shared secrets, and lived the kind of close high school friendship that parents often see as normal. Skylar Neese was 16 years old. She lived in Star City, West Virginia, and she was the only child of Dave and Mary Neese. She was known as bright, funny, and full of personality. She worked part-time, went to school, and had plans for a future that should have stretched far beyond the summer of 2012. Her two close friends were Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. To people outside the friendship, they looked like ordinary teenage girls. They posted online. They spent time together. They moved through school and social circles like so many teenagers do, sometimes close, sometimes dramatic, sometimes messy, but not obviously dangerous. That is what made the truth so hard to accept. Nothing about the surface image looked like a murder plot. On the night of July 5, 2012, Skylar returned home after work. Later, in the early hours of July 6, she climbed out of her bedroom window and left the apartment complex. Surveillance footage showed her getting into a car. At first, this looked like a runaway case to some authorities. A teenager leaving home late at night. No immediate public scene. No obvious sign of a violent crime. Her parents, however, knew something was wrong. Skylar had left behind things she would have needed if she planned to disappear for long. She had planned to come back. That small fact became one of the earliest signs that the first assumption did not fit. For months, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf were part of the world around the search for Skylar. They were not immediately exposed as the people responsible. They had time to live with the secret. Time to watch Skylar's parents suffer. Time to see flyers, questions, rumors, and fears spread through the community. And still they kept the lie alive. The story they gave was that they had picked Skylar up, driven around, and later dropped her off. On the surface, it gave them a way to explain why Skylar had been seen getting into a car. It made them part of the timeline without admitting the truth. But detectives noticed things that did not fit. Investigators began checking statements. They looked at the surveillance video. They examined phone records, social connections, and the timeline of the night Skylar vanished. The deeper they looked, the harder it became to accept that Skylar had simply walked away after being dropped off. The friendship itself also became part of the investigation. Teen friendships can be intense. They can carry jealousy, secrets, shifting loyalty, and emotional pressure. But most teenage conflict fades with time. It does not end with a body hidden across state lines. In this case, prosecutors and court records later described something far darker. Shalia and Rachel wanted to end their friendship with Skylar, and they feared what she might reveal about them. Instead of pulling away, arguing, or telling the truth, they made a horrific choice. They decided to kill her. The truth finally began to break when Rachel Schoaf confessed. That confession changed everything. After months of uncertainty, Rachel told authorities what had happened. She and Shalia had picked Skylar up in Shalia's car. They had driven her to a remote location across the state line in Pennsylvania. Skylar believed she was with friends. She believed she was safe enough to leave home and get into that car. That trust became the opening for betrayal. Rachel's confession led investigators to the area where Skylar's body was found. The search that had lasted for months now had an answer, but it was not the answer her parents had hoped for. It was the answer no parent wants to receive. Their daughter had not run away. She had not disappeared into a new life. She had been killed by people she trusted. The legal consequences followed. Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 30-year prison sentence. Shalia Eddy pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence with mercy, meaning she would have the possibility of parole after serving a required period. Both girls were teenagers when the crime happened. Both had futures. Both had the chance to grow, change, move away from high school drama, and become adults far removed from the emotions of that summer. But one choice destroyed all of that. They chose betrayal over honesty. Violence over distance. A permanent act over a temporary conflict. The emotional weight of this case does not come only from the crime itself. It comes from the months afterward. The months where Skylar's family searched. The months where friends and neighbors wondered. The months where the girls responsible still lived with the knowledge of what they had done. That is the part that stays with people. Because Skylar was not taken by a stranger in a random moment. She walked out to meet people she knew. She trusted them enough to leave her home in the middle of the night. And that trust was used against her. For her parents, the loss was not just the loss of a daughter. It was the loss of certainty, safety, and the belief that the people closest to your child will protect her. For the community, the case became a painful lesson about how dangerous hidden resentment can become when it is mixed with secrecy, fear, and teenage arrogance. Shalia, Eddie, and Rachel Shoaf thought they could make the truth disappear. They thought a false story would last. They thought months of silence would protect them. But the investigation did what investigations often do. It kept pressing against the lie until it broke. And when it broke, it revealed a truth more painful than almost anyone had imagined. Skylar Neese had not vanished from her life. She had been betrayed by the very friends she believed she could trust. In the end, those two girls did not escape the consequences. They did not outgrow the choice. They did not move on from it. One horrific decision ended Skylar's life. And it destroyed the futures of the two teenagers who made it. Case 3. The teen neighbor who wanted to know what killing felt like. Some choices are made in anger. Some are made in panic. And some are so cold that they leave people searching for an explanation that may never feel human enough to understand. The case of Elizabeth Olten begins in St. Martins, Missouri in October 2009. Elizabeth was 9 years old. She was a child with a future still untouched by the kind of darkness that would later surround her name. She lived in a small community where neighbors knew one another, where children could still seem close to home, and where danger did not appear to be waiting just beyond an ordinary evening. The teenager at the center of the case was Alyssa Bustamante. She was 15 years old. To people who saw her from a distance, Alyssa was another teenager moving through school, family life, social media, and the emotional turbulence that can come with adolescence. But behind that surface, investigators would later find signs of something far more disturbing. There were references to dark thoughts, emotional instability, and a fascination with the idea of killing. Still, thoughts are not the same as action. Many teenagers struggle. Many write disturbing things. Many go through periods of anger, sadness, or darkness without ever hurting another person. That is why the choice Alyssa made became so horrifying. Because at some point, the darkness inside her stopped being private. It became a plan. On October 21, 2009, Elizabeth Olten disappeared after leaving to go to a friend's house. When she did not return, her family became alarmed. A missing child report quickly turned into a search. In a small community, fear spreads fast. Parents begin looking at roads, woods, neighbors, and last known movements. Every hour becomes heavier. At first, the question was simple and terrifying. Where was Elizabeth? But that question would soon become something worse. What had happened to her? Investigators began searching the area and speaking to people connected to Elizabeth's last movements. Alyssa Bustamante lived nearby. She was not a stranger from another city or some unknown person passing through. She was a teenage neighbor. And that made the truth even harder to accept. Authorities later said Alyssa led them to Elizabeth's body. The discovery ended the search, but it opened a deeper wound. Elizabeth had not wandered off. She had not been taken far away by a stranger. She had been killed close to home, by someone young enough that many people still wanted to see her as a child herself. Then came the evidence that made the case even more disturbing. Investigators said Alyssa had dug holes before the killing. They also pointed to writings and statements that revealed a motive almost impossible for Elizabeth's family to hear. According to authorities, Alyssa said she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That statement became the center of public horror. Because it did not sound like a fight that went too far. It did not sound like panic. It did not sound like a moment of confusion where a teenager lost control and then collapsed under regret. It sounded like curiosity turned into violence. And that is why this case fits the title so painfully. Alyssa Bustamante was 15 years old. Her life was not over before that day. There was still time for help, intervention, adulthood, therapy, change, and a future that did not include a prison sentence. But one horrific choice destroyed Elizabeth's life and permanently changed Alyssa's own. The investigation did not end with suspicion. It moved toward legal accountability. Alyssa was charged as an adult with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. That decision alone showed how seriously prosecutors viewed the case. Even though she was a juvenile, the nature of the crime, the planning, and the evidence pushed the case into adult court. Later, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. In 2012, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive 30-year sentence for armed criminal action. The courtroom could deliver a sentence, but it could not repair what had been taken. Elizabeth's family lost a 9-year-old girl who should have grown up. She should have had school years, birthdays, friendships, arguments, dreams, and ordinary memories that become a life. Instead, her name became attached to a case that people still discuss because of the age of the victim, the age of the offender, and the chilling motive behind the crime. The community also lost something. When a child is killed by a neighbor, the idea of safety changes. Parents begin to question assumptions they once lived with. They ask how close danger can be. They ask how a teenager could cross that line. They ask whether warning signs were missed. But the hardest truth is that no explanation can make the choice understandable in a way that feels complete. People can talk about mental health. They can talk about darkness, depression, fascination, fantasy, or impulse. Those things may help explain pieces of a person's life. But they do not erase responsibility for the decision that took Elizabeth's life. Alyssa Bustamante destroyed her future not because she had no choices left, but because she made the worst possible choice while a child's life was in her hands. That is the moral weight of this case. A teenager's curiosity became a killing. A neighbor became a danger. A child's ordinary walk turned into a tragedy. And the justice system was left to deal with something that no sentence could truly balance. The life of a 9-year-old girl ended by a 15-year-old who wanted to know what killing felt like. In the end, the case remains disturbing because it shows how one private darkness, when acted on, can destroy everything around it. Elizabeth Olten's life mattered before anyone knew the name of the teenager who killed her. She was not a lesson, not a headline, not a symbol. She was a child. And one horrific choice took away every future she should have had. Case 4. The son who hosted a party while his future was already gone. Some crimes are disturbing because of the violence. Others are disturbing because of what happens afterward. The Tyler Hadley case is remembered not only because a teenager killed his parents. It is remembered because after doing it, he opened the doors of the same house and invited people in. He was 17 years old. His parents were Blake Hadley and Mary Jo Hadley. They lived in Port St. Lucie, Florida, in what should have been an ordinary family home. Blake was 54. Mary Jo was 47. They were parents trying to raise a teenage son, trying to manage the difficulties that come with adolescence, boundaries, discipline, arguments, and concern. From the outside, Tyler looked like a troubled teenager, but still a teenager with a future. He had friends. He had a social life. He had time to change. At 17, most people are still unfinished. They are still becoming who they will be. But on July 16, 2011, Tyler made one horrific choice that ended his parents' lives and destroyed his own. Before the crime, there had been warning signs of trouble. Reports described Tyler as someone who had issues at home and a complicated relationship with his parents. He wanted to have a party. His parents were the obstacle. That is a simple sentence, but in this case it carries a terrible weight. Because for most teenagers, being told no leads to anger, slammed doors, arguments, or secret plans to sneak out. For Tyler Hadley, prosecutors said it became something far darker. That day he killed Blake and Mary Jo inside their home. Then he tried to hide what he had done. The bodies were concealed in the master bedroom. The house did not immediately become quiet and sealed off like a crime scene. Instead, Tyler continued with the plan that made this case infamous. He hosted a party. Dozens of teenagers came to the Hadley home. Music played. People talked, laughed, drank, moved through the house, and existed only feet away from the truth. Many of them had no idea that Blake and Mary Jo were dead behind a closed door. That is one of the reasons this case feels almost impossible to process. The same home that should have held a family became two things at once: a hidden crime scene and a teenage party. But that image would not survive the night. At some point, Tyler told a close friend what he had done. The friend, Michael Mandel, later became part of the public story because Tyler showed him the bodies. The moment changed everything. A secret Tyler may have believed he could control was now in the hands of someone else. That is often where teenage offenders miscalculate. They think silence will hold. They think friends will protect them. They think shock will freeze people forever. But a crime this serious does not stay inside a teenage circle for long. After leaving the party, the friend contacted authorities. Police came to the home. The story Tyler had tried to bury was now exposed. What had looked to partygoers like a reckless teenage night became a double murder investigation. Detectives did not need to search for a stranger. They did not need to build a distant suspect profile. The truth was inside the home, inside the timeline, and inside Tyler's own actions after the crime. The party itself became part of the horror. It showed the emotional disconnect between the act and the aftermath. It showed a teenager trying to cover a family's silence with noise. It showed someone standing in the middle of his own destroyed future and still acting as if the night could continue. The investigation led to criminal charges. Tyler Hadley was charged as an adult. Because he was 17, he could not receive the death penalty. But the charges were still among the most serious possible: 2 counts of first-degree murder. In 2014, Tyler pleaded no contest. That plea meant he did not fight the charges at trial in the way a not guilty plea would have required. The court convicted him and he received life sentences. Later, because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, his sentence became part of the broader legal issue around juvenile offenders and life sentences. Courts across the country had been forced to reconsider how young offenders were sentenced after major Supreme Court decisions. Tyler's sentence went through review, and he was re-sentenced to life with the required juvenile review mechanism. But whatever the legal structure around sentencing, the emotional truth of the case did not change. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were gone. Their son, who should have had decades ahead of him, was now a convicted murderer serving life. The house where the party happened became a symbol of everything that went wrong. For the community, it was not only a crime scene. It was a reminder that danger does not always arrive from outside. Sometimes it lives inside the family conflict people assume is normal until it becomes something no one can ignore. For the teenagers who attended the party, the night became something they would never forget. Some came expecting music and friends. They left connected forever to a case that would be discussed in news reports, documentaries, and courtrooms. For Tyler's surviving family members, the damage was deeper than any headline could explain. They did not only lose Blake and Mary Jo. They also lost the version of Tyler they thought might still be saved. That is the tragedy inside this case. At 17, Tyler Hadley had options he did not take. He could have walked away from an argument. He could have waited for anger to pass. He could have called someone. He could have chosen anything other than violence. Instead, one horrific decision turned his parents into victims and turned his own future into a prison sentence. This case disturbs people because of the contrast. A family home and a hidden crime scene. A teenage party and 2 murdered parents. Noise in the living room and silence behind the door. It shows how far a teenager can fall when resentment, impulse, and the desire for freedom become detached from empathy and consequence. Tyler Hadley did not escape the truth. The party ended. The police arrived. The bodies were found. The courtroom followed. And the future he might have had disappeared into the same night he tried to celebrate. Case 5. The classmate whose one walk became a life sentence. Some cases are difficult because the motive is complicated. Others are difficult because the motive seems almost impossible to explain. The case of Tristan Bailey begins in St. Johns County, Florida, in a community where families expected their children to be safe walking through familiar neighborhoods, going to school, and spending time with classmates. Tristan was 13 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, and a cheerleader. People who knew her described a young girl with energy, confidence, and a life still at the beginning. She was not someone who should have become the center of a murder investigation. She should have been thinking about school, friends, family, and the ordinary small moments that make up childhood. The teenager responsible was Aiden Fucci. He was 14 years old. Like many teenagers, he moved through school and his neighborhood in ways that seemed ordinary from the outside. He was not an adult with decades behind him. He was a boy barely into his teenage years, still young enough that most people would think of him as someone whose future could still be shaped. But on Mother's Day weekend in 2021, one horrific choice destroyed Tristan's life and changed Aiden's forever. Tristan was reported missing on May 9, 2021. For her family, the day began with fear that no parent should have to feel. A child was gone. A search began. Every hour mattered. Every unanswered call, every missed message, every place she might have gone became part of a growing panic. At first, the question was where she was. Then the question became who had last seen her. Investigators began piecing together Tristan's movements. They reviewed the area, gathered information, and looked at surveillance footage. In cases involving missing children, video can become one of the most important witnesses. Cameras do not feel fear. They do not forget. They do not change their story. They simply record what passed in front of them. And in this case, the footage began to speak. Investigators found evidence showing Tristan and Aiden walking together. Later footage showed Aiden returning alone. That detail became one of the first major cracks in any version of events that tried to separate him from what happened. Because if 2 teenagers walked toward a place together, But only one came back. Detectives would have to ask why. Then Tristan was found. The search ended in the worst possible way. She had not run away. She had not stayed out with friends. She had not gone somewhere and simply failed to contact home. She was dead. The investigation quickly focused on Aiden Fucci. Police searched for evidence. They looked at clothing, digital information, physical traces, and the timeline. They followed the kind of details that young offenders often underestimate. A teenager may believe that if nobody saw the exact moment, the truth can stay hidden. But investigations are built from pieces. A camera, a statement, a stain, a missing item, a timeline that does not match. The first story may sound empty or confusing. Then the evidence starts filling in the silence. Aiden was first arrested and charged in connection with Tristan's death. The case was later moved into adult court, and the charge became first-degree murder. That decision reflected how seriously prosecutors viewed the evidence and the nature of the crime, even though Aiden had been only 14 at the time. 4 months the case moved toward trial. Then, in February 2023, just before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Aiden Fucci pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. That plea changed the courtroom path. There would not be a full trial over whether he was responsible. The focus shifted to sentencing. Because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, the law treated his punishment differently from an adult death penalty case. But the sentence could still be extremely severe. At sentencing, Tristan's family had to speak about a loss that no sentence could repair. That is one of the hardest parts of any courtroom like this. The legal system asks families to turn grief into words. Parents, siblings, and loved ones stand in a room near the person responsible and try to explain the size of a life that was taken. But how do you measure a 13-year-old girl's future? How do you explain birthdays that will never happen, graduations she will never attend, family photos she will never be in, and the daily silence left behind in a home that once had her voice? The judge sentenced Aiden Fucci to life in prison. A teenager who had once walked through the same school and community as Tristan was now facing a future behind bars. This case fits the title because it shows the full weight of one horrific choice. Aiden Fucci was not an adult whose life was already fully written. He was 14. His future could have been anything. He could have grown, changed, learned, failed, recovered, and become someone completely different from the worst thoughts he may have carried. But the choice he made did not only affect him. It ended Tristan Bailey's life. And that is where the moral weight must stay. Sometimes people focus on the age of the offender and forget the age of the victim. But Tristan was even younger. She was a child. She had no chance to move beyond that night. She had no chance to become the adult she might have been. For Aiden, the future became prison. For Tristan, the future was taken completely. That imbalance is what makes the case so painful. The investigation showed that a teenager can make a choice so serious that childhood cannot shield him from consequence. It also showed how modern evidence can break through silence. Surveillance footage, physical evidence, police work, and courtroom procedure all moved the case toward the truth. Aiden Fucci may have thought the night would stay hidden in darkness. But the evidence followed him back. And in the end, one walk, one act, and one decision destroyed every future connected to it. Tristan Bailey should be remembered not as a case file, but as a young girl whose life mattered long before the world learned the name of the boy who killed her. Her family carried that loss into court. The community carried it afterward. And Aiden Fucci carried his choice into a life sentence. Case 6. The daughter whose story kept changing. Some teenage crimes begin with an explosion of anger. Others begin with a secret life that slowly pulls a family apart. The case of Sarah Johnson begins in Bellevue, Idaho, in a home that from the outside looked stable, successful, and close. Her parents, Alan and Diane Johnson, had built a life together. Alan worked in landscaping. Diane worked at a medical clinic. They had a home, a family, and a teenage daughter who still had every chance to grow beyond conflict, rebellion, and emotional pressure. Sarah Johnson was 16 years old. At that age, many teenagers argue with parents. They push boundaries. They fight over relationships, independence, curfews, and the right to make choices adults believe they are not ready to make. Most of those conflicts end with slammed doors, tears, silence, punishment, or time. But in this case, the conflict became something no family could survive. According to prosecutors and reporting, tension inside the Johnson family had grown around Sarah's relationship with an older boyfriend. Her parents did not approve. They were concerned, and the relationship had become a source of serious arguments. Court records later noted that prosecutors argued Sarah was angry because her parents planned to report her 19-year-old boyfriend to police. That was the hidden pressure beneath the family image. A teenage daughter wanted independence. Her parents tried to stop a relationship they believed was dangerous. The arguments became intense. But nothing about a parent's disapproval should ever lead to murder. On September 2, 2003, Alan and Diane Johnson were shot and killed inside their home. Sarah was home at the time. After the shootings, she ran to a neighbor's house and police were called. At first, the situation appeared to be the kind of emergency where the surviving child might be seen only as a traumatized victim. A 16-year-old girl had just lost both parents in one morning. Most people would expect panic, grief, shock, and confusion. But investigators soon began noticing things that did not fit. Sarah gave different accounts of what she had been doing, what she heard, and where she was when the shots were fired. In a murder investigation, changing details matter. They do not always prove guilt by themselves. Trauma can affect memory. Shock can make someone confused. But when the changes connect to physical evidence, detectives look closer. And the physical evidence in this case became difficult to ignore. Police found items in a garbage can outside the residence, including a latex glove, a leather glove, and a pink robe covered in blood that belonged to Sarah. Court records state that Sarah's DNA was found inside the latex glove. Paint chips found inside the robe matched paint on the shirt she was wearing that morning. Investigators also found a matching leather glove in Sarah's bedroom, along with other items connected to the case. The murder weapon was a .264 rifle kept in the guesthouse. Court records said Sarah had access to that guesthouse, knew the renter was away, and knew guns were kept there. A guesthouse key and unspent .264 caliber shells were also found in her room. Then there was the injury. A physical examination found linear bruising on Sarah's shoulder that was described as consistent with a recent impact, such as gun recoil. Sarah gave another explanation for the bruising, saying it came from tripping over a coffee table at her boyfriend's home. But that explanation had to compete with the rest of the evidence. The changing statements, the items in the garbage, the DNA, the rope, the gloves, the access to the guesthouse, the rifle, the shells, the bruising. Piece by piece, the investigation moved away from an unknown intruder and toward the teenage daughter inside the home. That is what makes this case fit the title so strongly. Sarah Johnson had a future before that morning. She could have grown out of the relationship conflict. She could have fought with her parents and later understood them differently. She could have left home as an adult, rebuilt trust, made mistakes, recovered from them, and moved forward. But one horrific choice ended Alan and Diane's lives and turned Sarah's future into a prison sentence. At trial, Sarah continued to deny involvement. The defense raised questions including about fingerprints and the possibility of someone else being connected to the weapon. The case had disputed points, and later appeals continued to challenge aspects of the evidence and her sentence. But the jury heard the evidence and convicted her. In 2005, Sarah Johnson was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 fixed life terms, plus a 15-year firearm enhancement. Her conviction was later upheld on appeal, and later efforts to challenge the sentence and seek relief were also rejected. The courtroom outcome made clear that the legal system did not accept Sarah's version of events. The court records show that even years later, the evidence against her remained substantial in the eyes of the Idaho Supreme Court. But no legal opinion can fully measure the human cost. Alan and Diane Johnson were not just names in a case file. They were parents. They were people with a family, work, routines, friends, and a future of their own. They were trying, in the way parents often do, to protect their child from what they believed was danger. That effort ended with their deaths. For Sarah's surviving family, the tragedy carried 2 kinds of loss. They lost Alan and Diane to murder. And they lost Sarah to the consequences of being convicted of that murder. That is the painful truth behind teenage parricide cases. The crime does not create one wound. It tears through an entire family tree. It leaves relatives grieving victims while also trying to understand how the child they knew became the person convicted. Sarah Johnson's case disturbs people because the conflict began in a place many families recognize: parents and a teenager fighting over a relationship. But the ending was something almost no one can imagine. A disagreement became deadly. A daughter became a defendant. A home became a crime scene. And the future Sarah might have had as a daughter, sister, student, and adult disappeared into a life sentence. This case is a reminder that one moment of violence does not solve the pressure a person feels. It does not create freedom. It does not protect love. It does not prove independence. It only creates loss. Case 7. The neighbor boy who hid the truth beneath his bed. Some horrific choices are followed by confession. Others are followed by silence. But in the case of Maddie Clifton, the silence lasted for days while an entire neighborhood searched for a missing little girl, Not knowing the truth was only steps away. Maddie Clifton was 8 years old. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and on November 3, 1998, she came home from school, practiced piano, and went outside to play. It was the kind of ordinary childhood routine that should never become important in a murder case. A child finishing school. A piano lesson. A few minutes outside before dinner. The teenager at the center of the case was Joshua Phillips. He was 14 years old. He lived nearby. He was not a stranger in a passing car. He was a neighborhood boy, someone close enough that the setting still felt familiar, still felt safe, still looked like a normal street where children could play. That is what makes the case so painful. The danger was not far away. It was next door. When Maddie did not come home for dinner, her mother became worried. Soon, neighbors began searching. Police were called. What began as a missing child emergency spread across the community with the kind of fear that grows heavier every hour. A child had vanished from a neighborhood where she should have been found quickly. And during that search, Joshua Phillips was there. Court records later noted that he took part in the neighborhood search and appeared to be acting normal, though witnesses described details that would later seem strange. At the time, however, no one knew what had happened. People were searching yards, talking to neighbors, and hoping Maddie might still be found alive. But that hope was sitting beside a hidden truth. The first cracks came as police began speaking to people in the area. A detective questioned Joshua, and he said he had seen Maddie but had not played with her. Investigators searched parts of the Phillips property, including a storage shed and vehicle, but they did not find Maddie. For days the answer stayed hidden. Then, on November 10, 1998, the case changed. Joshua's mother noticed something wrong inside his room and alerted officers who were still working in the neighborhood. When police entered the room, they discovered Maddie's body hidden beneath Joshua's waterbed. The search was over. But the horror was only beginning. For Maddie's family, the discovery answered the question of where she was, but it replaced that question with something worse. She had not been far from home. She had not been taken somewhere distant. She had been hidden inside the room of a teenage neighbor while the community searched for her. That detail became one of the most disturbing parts of the case. A child was missing and the person responsible was living beside the search. Joshua later told police that Maddie's death began as an accident. According to reports, he claimed they had been playing and that he panicked after she was hurt. He said he was afraid of his father and afraid of getting in trouble. But the courts did not treat the case as a simple accident. Joshua Phillips was tried as an adult for first-degree murder. At trial, the jury heard evidence about what happened, about where Maddie was found, and about Joshua's actions after the crime. The fact that Maddie had been hidden for days became central to the emotional weight of the case. It showed not only the killing, but the choice to conceal the truth while her family searched. That is why this case fits the title. Joshua was 14 years old. He still had a future before November 3, 1998. He could have called for help. He could have told the truth. He could have screamed, run to an adult, or allowed someone to try to save Maddie if there was any chance left. Instead, the truth was hidden. And the hiding became part of the tragedy. A teenager may panic. A child may fear punishment. A young person may make a terrible mistake and not know what to do next. But the law had to look at what happened after that first moment. It had to look at the choices that followed. It had to look at concealment, silence, and the fact that a family was left searching while their daughter was hidden nearby. In 1999, Joshua Phillips was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Years later, after major changes in how courts handled juvenile life sentences, his case returned to court for resentencing review. In 2017, he was resentenced to life again, with the possibility of future review under juvenile sentencing rules. His appeals and sentence review proceedings continued for years, and reporting in 2026 said he withdrew a bid for sentence review, citing a need for professional counseling. The legal system continued to wrestle with one question: how should the law punish a person who committed murder at 14? But Maddie's family carried a different question. What about the child who never got to grow older? That is the emotional center of this case. Joshua Phillips was young, but Maddie was younger. Much younger. She was 8. She had a childhood still unfolding. She had school, family, music, friends, and ordinary days ahead of her. She did not get the chance to become a teenager or an adult or anything beyond the little girl who went outside to play and never came home. This case disturbs people because it combines two realities that are hard to hold at the same time. The offender was a child. The victim was also a child. One was old enough to make a devastating choice. The other was young enough to trust the world around her. And one horrific choice destroyed both futures in different ways. Maddie's life was taken completely. Joshua's life became defined by a murder conviction, prison, appeals, and the consequences of what happened in that bedroom. The neighborhood searched for days, but the truth had been nearby the entire time. That is why the case remains so haunting. It shows how fear of consequences can become worse than the truth itself. It shows how a terrible act can become even more destructive when someone chooses silence afterward. And it shows that being young does not erase the harm created by a decision that takes another child's life. Maddie Clifton should be remembered first as a child, not as a case. She had a name, a family, a home, and a life before the world learned about the boy next door. Joshua Phillips made one horrific choice. Then he made another by hiding. And together, those choices destroyed the future Maddie should have had and the future he could have lived. Case 8. The friends who turned teen drama into a prison sentence. Some teenage conflicts feel enormous when they are happening. A rumor can feel like betrayal. A friendship shift can feel like humiliation. A crush, a look, a comment, or a social rejection can seem like the center of the world. But most teenagers survive those moments. They grow older. They leave school. They meet new people. They realize that the drama that once felt unbearable was only one chapter in a much longer life. The murder of Adrienne Reynolds is a case about what happens when teenagers make one horrific choice inside emotions that should have passed with time. Adrienne was 16 years old. She had moved to East Moline, Illinois, to live with family and was attending an alternative education program. She was trying to build a future. Reports described her as someone who wanted to eventually join the Marines. She had a job, a school routine, and the normal desire many teenagers have, to belong, to make friends, to be accepted. The two teenagers at the center of the case were Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory. Sarah was 16. Corey was 17. They were not strangers to Adrienne. They were part of her social world. They knew her. They were close enough for a simple lunch invitation to seem safe. That is what makes the case so painful. Adrienne did not walk toward danger because she recognized it. She walked toward people she knew. On January 21, 2005, Sarah invited Adrienne to go to lunch. Corey Gregory and another teen, Sean McKittrick, were also involved in that outing. What should have been an ordinary afternoon among teenagers turned into the beginning of a murder case. The hidden tension, according to reporting and later court records, involved conflict between the teens, including jealousy, friendship pressure, and social drama around who was close to whom. In another life, those emotions might have ended with arguments, distance, or a friendship breaking apart. But that image would not survive what happened next. The group went to a Taco Bell parking lot in Moline, Illinois. At some point, a confrontation began. Sean McKittrick left. Adrienne was left with Sarah and Corey. What followed was the moment that destroyed every future connected to the case. Adrienne was killed. The exact details are difficult and should not be treated like spectacle. What matters most is that a 16-year-old girl who should have gone home and gone to work never got that chance. After the killing, Sarah and Corey did not immediately tell the truth. They tried to hide what had happened. They moved into concealment, panic, and cover-up. The crime did not end with the act itself. It became a series of choices that made the tragedy even deeper. Adrienne's family soon knew something was wrong. She was supposed to go to work. She did not show up. Her absence was not normal. This was not a teenager simply avoiding responsibility or disappearing for a few hours. The people who loved her understood that Adrienne's silence meant something serious had happened. Police began investigating. At first they had a missing teenager. Then they had questions about who she had last been with, where she had gone, and why the explanations around her disappearance did not feel complete. The first cracks came from the people connected to her final hours. Investigators learned about the lunch plan. They learned about the teens involved. They began putting together statements, locations, and timelines. In cases like this, the truth often begins with small contradictions. One person says too much. Another person says too little. A timeline shifts. A detail does not match. And then one of the teenagers led police to the truth. Corey Gregory eventually led authorities to Adrienne's remains. That moment changed the case from a disappearance into a homicide prosecution. The hiding was over. The cover story had failed. The evidence and the statements now pointed directly back toward the teenagers who had been with Adrienne. The legal process that followed was heavy. Sarah Kolb went to trial. Her first trial ended in a mistrial after the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. But at her retrial, she was convicted. She received 48 years for murder and an additional 5 years for concealment, for a total of 53 years. Corey Gregory pleaded guilty and received 40 years for murder plus 5 years for concealment, for a total of 45 years. Because Corey was 17 at the time, later legal proceedings focused on juvenile sentencing issues. Recent reporting noted that Gregory, now known as Harley Quinn in later coverage, continued through resentencing litigation, with another resentencing hearing ordered after appellate review. But the core legal truth remains. Both teens were convicted for their roles in Adrienne Reynolds' death and the concealment that followed. This case fits the title because it shows how one teenage conflict became a permanent sentence. Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory had futures before that day. They could have left the argument behind. They could have walked away from the social tension. They could have ended a friendship, changed schools, moved towns, grown older, and eventually looked back on teenage drama as something painful but temporary. Instead, they made the choice that turned Adrienne into a victim and themselves into convicted killers. That is the moral weight of the case. Teenage emotions can feel powerful, but they are not permission to destroy another person's life. Jealousy is not destiny. Anger is not a sentence. Social rejection is not a reason to kill. The moment may feel overwhelming, but it passes, unless someone makes a choice that can never be undone. Adrienne Reynolds was not just the girl at the center of a fight. She was a person trying to build her life. She had family waiting for her. She had a job shift she never reached. She had dreams beyond the small circle of teenage conflict that ended her life. For her loved ones, the loss did not stop when the case was solved. Court dates, trials, appeals, resentencing hearings, and media attention meant the wound kept being reopened. Every legal development brought the story back, but nothing could bring Adrienne back with it. That is why this case remains so disturbing. It shows how quickly a temporary teenage world can become permanent. A friendship can become a motive. A lunch invitation can become a trap. A bad decision can become a murder conviction. And one afternoon can erase every future that might have existed. Case 9. The honor student who returned to a sleepover after killing his family. Some cases are disturbing because the offender looks dangerous from the beginning. Others are disturbing because the offender looks like the kind of teenager adults still believe they understand. Nicholas Browning was 15 years old when his life changed forever. He lived in Caucusville, Maryland, with his parents, John and Tamara Browning, and his two younger brothers, Gregory and Benjamin. From the outside, the Browning family looked stable, respected, and deeply rooted in an ordinary suburban life. John Browning was an attorney. The family was active in the community. Neighbors later described them as kind people, the kind of family who seemed to care about the area around them. Nicholas did not look like someone whose name would become attached to a quadruple murder case. He had been described in reporting as an honor student and former Boy Scout. He was a teenage boy with school, friends, activities, and a future still unwritten. Whatever problems existed inside the family, whatever anger or resentment he carried, there was still time for those conflicts to be faced without destroying everything. But one horrific choice erased that future. In early February 2008, Nicholas was spending time at a friend's house. According to police and later reporting, he left after midnight and walked back home. Inside that home were the people closest to him. His father. His mother. His two younger brothers. They were not strangers. They were not people he had met in a brief conflict. They were his family. They were sleeping in the home where Nicholas had grown up, the place that should have represented safety, memory, and belonging. But that night, the family home became a crime scene. Police said Nicholas used his father's handgun to kill John, Tamara, Gregory, and Benjamin as they slept. Afterward, he left the house and returned to his friend's home. That detail is one of the most chilling parts of the case. Because after killing his family, Nicholas did not immediately call police. He did not collapse into a confession. He did not run to someone in panic and say what he had done. He went back to the sleepover. He spent time with friends. He pretended nothing had happened. That image would later become central to why people remembered the case so strongly. A teenage boy moving between two worlds in the same night. In one world, his family was dead inside their home. In the other, he was still acting like a normal kid at a friend's house. But the lie could not last. The next day, friends took Nicholas back home. According to reporting, he went inside and came back out saying his father was dead. It was the beginning of the public version of the tragedy, the moment where the hidden crime started becoming a police investigation. At first, the scene was shocking. For members of one family had been killed. A teenage son had survived. Investigators had to determine whether an outside attacker was involved, whether the family had been targeted, and why Nicholas was the only one left. Then the first cracks began to open. Police questioned him. They looked at the timeline. They examined where he had been, where he said he had been, and how the killings could have happened while he was supposedly away. In family murder cases, the surviving family member's story is always examined carefully. Investigators cannot rely on appearance. They have to follow evidence. Soon Nicholas confessed. He admitted to the killings, according to police, and told investigators where they could find the murder weapon. That confession moved the case from a mystery about who killed the Browning family into a horrifying question of why a 15-year-old son would kill nearly everyone in his own home. The motive remained complicated and disputed. Defense attorneys later argued that Nicholas had suffered years of abuse from his father and that the killings happened under the weight of that pain. Prosecutors pushed back, especially on the deaths of the younger brothers. They argued that the abuse claim did not explain why Gregory and Benjamin were killed. Reporting also noted that prosecutors played portions of a police interview in which Nicholas, while initially claiming innocence, mentioned inheritance and life insurance. A serious telling of this case has to acknowledge both points. The defense offered an explanation built around alleged abuse. The prosecution challenged that explanation and pointed to other possible motives and contradictions. But no explanation could change the legal reality of what happened. John, Tamara, Gregory, and Benjamin Browning were dead, and Nicholas admitted responsibility. He was charged as an adult with 4 counts of first-degree murder. In October 2008, Nicholas pleaded guilty. At sentencing in January 2009, he was 16 years old. The court ordered 4 life sentences. 2 were to be served consecutively and 2 concurrently. Under the structure reported at the time, he could become eligible for parole after decades in prison. In court, Nicholas tried to apologize. Reporting described him becoming emotional and unable to fully read his statement. The only words he managed to say were, "I'm so sorry." But those words could not restore what had been taken. The Browning family was gone. John and Tamara were not only parents. They were people with work, relationships, routines, and lives beyond the tragedy. Gregory and Benjamin were children themselves, younger brothers who had no control over whatever conflict existed between Nicholas and his parents. That is one of the most painful truths in this case. Even if there were problems inside the family, even if Nicholas felt trapped, angry, or desperate, his brothers were still children. They were part of the future he destroyed. They were victims of a choice they did not create and could not escape. This case fits the title because Nicholas Browning's future was not already over before that night. He was 15. He had time. He had options. He could have asked for help. He could have left the house. He could have told someone what he believed was happening. He could have made almost any choice other than murder. Instead, he made the choice that ended 4 lives and sent his own into a prison sentence. The tragedy is not only that a family was killed. It is that a teenager moved from ordinary life to irreversible violence in a single night, then tried to step back into ordinary life as if the 2 worlds could remain separate. But they could not. The truth followed him. The police found the timeline. Case 10. The teen hero whose secret darkness became a life sentence. Some cases are disturbing because the offender already looked dangerous. Others are disturbing because the public image and the hidden truth seem impossible to place inside the same person. Daniel Marsh was only 15 years old when he made the choice that destroyed 2 lives and changed his own forever. The victims were Claudia Maupin and Oliver Chip Northup, an elderly couple living in Davis, California. They were not connected to Daniel through a family conflict, a school fight, or a personal grudge. They were simply people in his community, living inside their own home, with no reason to believe a teenager nearby would become the danger that ended everything. Daniel's public image had once been very different. Years before the murders, he had been known locally for helping save his father during a medical emergency. That kind of story can shape how people see a child. Brave, quick thinking, caring. A boy capable of doing something good when it mattered. But that image would not survive the investigation. Behind the story of the boy once praised for saving a life, prosecutors described a much darker private world. Court records and trial evidence pointed to violent thoughts and fantasies that had existed before the crime. This was not presented as a sudden argument or a robbery that went wrong. Prosecutors argued that Daniel had been drawn toward the idea of killing and eventually acted on that darkness. In April 2013, Daniel moved through a Davis neighborhood at night. According to the case record, he entered the home where Claudia and Chip were sleeping. They were older, vulnerable, and in the place where they should have been safest. Their home became the place where a teenager's hidden fantasy crossed into reality. A serious documentary does not need to describe every violent detail to make the truth clear. What matters is that Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup were killed inside their own home by someone who had no personal reason to target them and no right to be there. After the deaths, investigators faced a difficult kind of case. There was no obvious family suspect. No clear dispute. No simple motive connecting the victims to someone close to them. When a crime appears random, detectives have to build the truth from fragments. The scene, the neighborhood, witness statements, physical evidence, interviews, and the behavior of anyone who comes under suspicion. Eventually, Daniel Marsh became the focus. When police questioned him, the hidden truth began to come out. His statements, the evidence, and the investigation revealed a contrast that disturbed the community. The teenager once associated with saving life was now accused of taking two. The case went to trial and Daniel was tried as an adult. A jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The jury also found him sane at the time of the crime. That point mattered because mental health questions were part of the courtroom story. The defense raised issues about his state of mind, but after hearing the evidence, the jury still found him legally responsible. Daniel Marsh was sentenced to 52 years to life. Because he was a juvenile when the crime happened, his case later became connected to the larger legal debate over how young offenders should be sentenced. Laws around juvenile punishment changed, and his case went through further review. But the emotional center of the case never changed. Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup were gone. Their family lost people who should have been able to live safely in their later years. Their home, the place that should have protected them, became the center of a tragedy caused by someone they barely knew. This case fits the title because Daniel Marsh still had a future before that night. He could have received help. He could have spoken about violent thoughts. He could have stepped away before fantasy became action. He could have been remembered only as the boy who once saved his father. Instead, his name became tied forever to the deaths of Claudia and Chip. That is the tragedy of the contrast. A boy once called a hero became a convicted murderer. A community that once saw promise had to face hidden violence. And a future that might have been built on change, help, and recovery became a sentence measured in decades. Daniel Marsh made one horrific choice. Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup paid for it with their lives. And Daniel carried that choice into a life sentence.